lovely to meet you, Louis. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, yeah. It should be fun.
When we read it in the office, first of all, we felt it perfectly illustrated some of the themes, opportunities, and challenges with technological innovation and data sharing that we're trying to get people to understand. Why was it so important for you to tell this story?
It comes from the fact that I've been involved in the development of virtual reality and augmented reality for over 30 years. And I started way back as a researcher at Stanford and NASA, working on early VR headsets, and then I was funded by the U.S. Air Force to build the first augmented reality system, and then I founded a number of companies in this space. So I'm a true believer that virtual reality, augmented reality, which is now called the metaverse, can really be positive for society. But at the same time, I've been at this long enough that I am very concerned about the risks. The risks that come with immersing ourselves in a technological medium that could be so overwhelming. I mean, it will be everywhere in our lives from morning till night. It could be invasive, it could be coercive, it could be manipulative. And even if we don't want it, even if we want to stay out of the metaverse, right, we don't necessarily have a choice, which is why this story is unique in that it's about an older man, Gordon Pines, who actually doesn't want to be in the metaverse, but he realizes he doesn't have a choice. And that's how we experience technology today. There was a time when everyone just had a flip phone and nobody thought they needed a smartphone. Nobody thought they would spend $1,000 on a phone. And then at some point, you just don't have a choice. Like, everybody has to do that. And so, in this story, I really try to convey a balanced picture of showing that there are good things that come into Gordon's life with the technology, but there are also significant negatives. And these are the things that we as a society really need to consider as we enter this unknown. So I see the story as a warning. It's a warning in a very balanced format. It's not, it's not super dark. And I do write a lot of dark fiction. This is not super dark, and it's deliberately not dark because there are lots of people who are excited about the metaverse. And I'm excited about the metaverse, but unless we really consider the dangers, very bad things could happen. And that's really the point of telling this story.
Certainly one of the things that we loved about it, because as a data protection authority, people hear our title and they almost disengage almost immediately. And what we loved about your story is it explored these themes that we care deeply about, but in a really heartwarming way. But underneath the surface, there's this really uncomfortable subtext, which really, it's a story that has a happy ending, but it does, as you said, it has a warning. It's got a very serious message.
Again, there's positive things that will come out of the metaverse. I really do believe that, but there are, serious dangers that we need to consider, and we need to consider. And when we say metaverse, I really want people to realize it's both virtual worlds and augmented worlds. It's both, and we should be concerned. But it's not the technology that I fear about the metaverse. It's the power that this technology will give to the metaverse platforms. And it's actually useful to think of social media as an example. Like, social media, when 15 years ago, was this utopian technology, and we all were sure that it was going to do these great things, bring the world together, empower people who didn't have a voice, promote democracy, and it really did all those things. And at the same time, it also created all these really damaging problems. And again, it wasn't the technology of social media that caused these problems. It was the business models that the corporations adopted. And so when we look at social media, we can say, well, what's the business models that they adopted? Well, they became, the social media platforms are experts at tracking, profiling, and targeting users. That's their business. And the social media part of it is just what enables their business. And so if you consider that and you say, well, look, social media was this utopian technology, and when we develop business models that are focused on tracking and targeting and profiling, we ended up with a world where social media companies can manipulate people, can polarize whole populations, can drive misinformation and disinformation. None of that was expected. So now let's consider the metaverse. Okay, so the metaverse, I see it as the same principles of tracking, profiling, and targeting will be, if it's unregulated, will be implemented in the metaverse, but will be much, much worse. And so if you think about social media, when we say tracking, like, what does that mean? It means tracking where you click and who your friends are. In the metaverse, tracking means knowing where you are, who you're with, what you're doing, what direction you're looking. If you're walking down the street in the metaverse, the way Gordon Pines does in the story, platforms will be able to track, where he is, what windows he's looking in as he walks down the street, how long his gaze lingers, how fast his gait is moving, whether he slows down, speeds up. In the metaverse, and this is also discussed in the story, these platforms will be able to track your emotions by looking at your facial expressions, your vocal inflections, your pupil dilation, blood patterns on your faces. And so in the metaverse, instead of just tracking, where you click and who your friends are, they will know everything you do and everything you feel while you're doing it. And that is a real danger. At the same time, the other thing about social media is that they don't just track this information, they use this information to persuade you. And they do that through targeted advertising and targeted news feeds. Same thing could happen in the metaverse, but in the metaverse, a targeted advertisement isn't just a pop-up ad that you see or a video that pops up. A targeted advertisement is an immersive experience. It's a virtual product placement that can be put into the world that you might not even recognize as an advertisement. And we see this in Gordon's world in the story. He's walking down the street and he sees things that just look like parts of the world, and they're actually advertisements. They're trying to engage him, influence him, persuade him. They even include virtual spokespeople that will engage him in promotional conversation. And that's a big part of the story, is these promotional conversations. It doesn't get very dark, but it could in the real world. A promotional conversation means that you will be engaged with some virtual character. You might not even know that it's promotional. You might not know that you were targeted. And it's going to engage you in conversation to persuade you to buy a product or buy a service, or maybe believe a political idea. And if at the same time that promotional conversation, that the AI that's controlling it has access to your facial expressions and your vocal inflections and your pupil dilation, it will be able to adjust its tactics in real time to persuade you. And again, in the story, it doesn't get dark, but these same techniques could be used to create the most powerful form of persuasion and propaganda that we've ever known, because you have people who will engage a world and have platforms that can control everything that they can see, everything they can hear, AI algorithms that are watching and assessing their emotions and manipulating their tactics. And so unless there's regulation, unless there's controls put in place, it could become a very, very dangerous technology.
There are two things that we worry about. The first is that technology is developing at breakneck speed. And these things that you're describing, these are developing now. These are happening now. And regulation cannot keep pace with it. So we need, as you said, maybe to have greater cooperation with the tech companies to develop technologies together. And we believe, as a regulator, that regulation should not be a blocker. It should be part of the conversation. It needs to be part of how technology evolves. But it doesn't necessarily seem to be happening in this case, because it's just evolving too fast. And the other thing that we worry about is that people are happily sleepwalking into this almost nightmarish situation that you're describing, where they are being manipulated. They're not even aware of what they're sharing. And you'd said that it's interesting to hear you, as someone who is a kind of pioneer in sort of augmented reality, to be saying, look, I love this, I was part of its growth, but it needs to carry on growing, but in the right way. And how do you feel that should be done?
So I absolutely agree that regulation is super important. Without regulation, we will go down the same path that social media went, where companies had good intentions. developers had utopian vision, but the business models evolved and companies competed with each other to push the business models further and further in certain directions. And you end up with this very negative outcome that nobody expected. In the metaverse, same thing will happen unless there's regulation. And yet it will be worse because the technology is so much more intimate. You log into a social media platform. In the metaverse, you are actually submitting yourselves to become an inhabitant in a social media, in a metaverse platform. And you're allowing a platform to control everything you see and hear and feel and track everything you do. And so there's the potential where they can literally change the world around you without you even knowing it, without you even being able to tell the difference between something that's promotional and something that's authentic. And so when we think about regulation, to me, we almost need to take a step up and say, let's think about human rights. Let's think about what I would call immersive rights. Do I have the right in the metaverse to know the difference between an authentic experience and a manipulated experience? I think that's the single most important thing, because otherwise you can imagine a scenario where, I'm walking down the street and I see a parked car, and there's some people standing outside the car talking about how great it is. The driver's telling their friend how great this car is, and I just hear it, and I think, oh, that's that, and I just think that's part of my world, and I keep walking, and that influences me because I think it's authentic. And I don't realize, no, that was a targeted advertisement that was placed there. It was placed there specifically for me. Other people walking down that same street saw something else. It was placed there where they chose the type of car, the color of the car, the actual ethnicity of the people, the hair color. They chose everything to be the most persuasive to me that they could have, because they've been tracking me for morning till night for months or weeks or years. And so I could have these experiences that I think are authentic, but they're very highly targeted. They're intended to persuade me. And it doesn't have to be to persuade me to buy a car. It could be persuade me to believe a political message, to believe a piece of misinformation, disinformation. But if there's regulation that protects the basic right to authentic experiences, to me, that would mean that if a platform does that, that targeted experience has to look and sound different. I as a person in this world need to be able to tell the difference between an authentic experience I just happened to come across and a targeted experience that was placed there to manipulate me. If I can at least tell the difference, then I can draw upon my skepticism, I have the ability to potentially be, resist this persuasion. If I can't tell the difference, then I have no idea. And that's one of the big differences with social media. In social media, which is extremely persuasive, at least I know an advertisement is an advertisement. In the metaverse, unless there's regulation, we won't even know what is real and what is targeted. And then, in the metaverse, there's the question of, do we even want to allow platforms to track your pupil dilation and your blood pressure and your facial blood patterns and your facial expressions to infer your emotions? I think that most people don't want to be engaged in a promotional advertisement and know that there's an AI that's looking at your blood pressure readings from your earbuds and adjusting its tactics to maximize persuasion based on. But unless there's regulation, these things will happen. I mean, the technology is there, and the companies are motivated to do it. And it won't just happen to adults; it'll happen to kids. And in fact, one of the scariest things that was announced recently is that one of the early metaverse platforms, Roblox, which is for kids, they have 50 million kids in their virtual world. They just announced last month that they're going to start immersive advertising on kids. That's their business model. They're going to roll out in 2023. And they're doing that because their revenue was struggling. They missed their numbers for the quarter. And in their quarterly meeting, they announced immersive advertising for kids. Now, what does that mean? I think what it means is that a kid will be walking in the metaverse, and a giant teddy bear is going to walk up to them and start talking to them and start convincing them of anything. And they won't know that it's an advertisement. They'll just think, oh, I made a friend with a giant teddy bear, and that teddy bear says I should buy this or believe that. And again, without regulation, super dangerous. So I believe that there's really positive things that can come out of the metaverse, but without regulation, it can go dark. And so you raise this issue of, how do we convince the public? How do we convince the industry that regulation is important? I think without regulation, there will be no trust. And if there's no trust, then these platforms will fail. Like, they need regulation to put guardrails in place so that this world is trusted by consumers, and then they can compete with each other on making the most magical experiences, rather than competing with each other to see who could make the best use of blood pressure and facial expressions to feed persuasive advertisements. So I am a big proponent of regulation, and any way we can push it, I think it's super important. And I think the industry should also want regulation so that their world is trustworthy.
We agree. I think trust is such an important factor, but as you mentioned a lot, the social media, well, there isn't an awful lot of trust with people there, and some people have turned off their social media accounts, but an awful lot of people who know that perhaps that their good faith in sharing their data has gone to places that they had no intention, but they have still continued to use these platforms. And that's one of the worries, is that there are continual harms being done, but these platforms are still functioning.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to this issue that sometimes people don't feel like they have a choice, right? They might, like, people know that social media is dangerous. They have these brands have really been tarnished by some of the damage done by these practices. But there are people who feel like unless they're using social media, they're at a disadvantage. They're at a disadvantage professionally, they're at a disadvantage socially, and so they have to use it. And so now regulators look at social media and say, well, we need to fix it. Really hard to fix social media after the fact. And it's because the business model's already developed. These companies already rely on profiling and targeting users. And if you put regulation in place that says, well, now you can't do that anymore, what's their business? The nice thing about the metaverse is that the business models haven't established themselves yet. They haven't been defined. It's actually at a time when regulation could guide the industry, can protect the industry and maintain trust. And I talk to policymakers in countries all around the world, and one of the things that they often say is, well, we can't even regulate social media. How are we going to regulate the metaverse? And my answer is, you can't regulate social media because you waited 10 years too long. And you can actually regulate the metaverse. You can regulate it because the business models aren't fully developed. And if you just put simple guardrails in place, then those business models will develop in a different way. And these companies will compete for customers in different ways. And it will work out well. And so, the time to regulate the metaverse is now, when people feel like it's a little too early. Once they feel like it's not too early, it's too late.
Well, that's why I think this conversation is so important, certainly for us. And that's why we're so grateful that you were able to talk with us today, because one of the things that we believe is that regulation on its own isn't enough, that we need to affect cultural change. We need to drive people to want to protect other people, and just to try and use initiatives so for example, this is all part of our project Bijou Content, which is a kind of social initiative to inspire cultural change and to help people not to be motivated, but this is the law, this is what you should do, but this is the right thing to do, and this will create a better society, that you will be more protected and will essentially be better for everybody. It's a good business model if you have trust, as you said. But do you feel that, for you, that's what you're doing? You're talking to us that cultural change is equally important.
Oh, I think cultural change is potentially the most important. And I say that because, it's easy to badmouth the corporations that created these business models, but the public was part of that decision, right? If you go back and you look at social media, you say, well, the public didn't want to pay subscriptions for social media. And they said, okay, well, we're happy to be advertised to, and we're happy to allow our data to be tracked because we're getting something for free. Now, I don't think the public realized the downside at that time, but now they can look at what happened with social media. They like we don't have that excuse anymore. We can say we can look at what happened with social media and say, okay, the metaverse is going to be worse in terms of the the privacy problems and also the manipulation problems. What is the culture that the public will take from that? Will the culture demand a safe metaverse? Will the culture demand that platforms are not allowed to track your emotions and use it in real time to manipulate you? Will the culture be willing to pay subscriptions instead of getting things for free in exchange for the services? Do we culturally realize that when we're advertised to, it's not free? We become the product that's being sold. And do you want to be the product that's sold in the metaverse, or do you want to be the customer? So cultural change in terms of just getting people awareness is important. The other cultural issue for the metaverse, which I think is just as important, is when we look at I've so far really talked about the dangers of corporate control of metaverse platforms. One of the other dangers in platforms is just user versus user dangers. In social media, we see bullying, we see exploitation, we see stalking, hate crimes, all kinds of bad things happen in the metaverse that happen in social media that are users on users. And in the metaverse, those things can be far worse. They become far more personal because it's immersive. They also become harder to moderate and mediate because they happen in real time. And in social media, if you're trying to stop hate in social media, that means stopping a piece of material from spreading too far. It means getting to it quickly. In the metaverse, it means stopping it in real time before it even happens, before somebody feels abused. That's difficult. What would be the most important thing would be a cultural change where people take personal responsibility in the metaverse, where they realize, no, this is like the real world. Currently people behave in social media in ways that they would never behave in person. They wouldn't. They feel like they have this sense of distance and anonymity, and they behave in these terrible ways. We can't, if that happens in the metaverse, we will have, big problems. If instead we have this cultural change and say, you know what, the metaverse is different. It is direct person-to-person interactions. People have to take personal responsibility, and people have to behave in ways just like they would in the real world. That too would make a very big difference in having a trusted, safe metaverse.
Do you think that stories like Metaverse 2030 have a powerful role to play in shaping our understanding of complex technological changes? And what you've just described is very much trying to get people to understand this brave new world.
Yeah, no, I believe story is really powerful for getting people to understand technologies that they haven't yet experienced for themselves. It's hard for people to appreciate the potential dangers. It's hard for people to even know what the potential capabilities are. For most people, they don't want to read a dull academic paper. And I do write some of those dull academic papers about metaverse dangers and metaverse regulation. But a story is a way to make it real for people, to make it and to make people appreciate it on a visceral level of what this really will be. And so I do think that for any new technology, whether it's virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, story can be more powerful than almost anything in helping people basically see the future and realize that future is not that far away.
Hopefully far enough away there that we can put some of these controls in place to create something that is positive and not just negative. Do you think, though, that the kind of legal, technological and cultural changes are undermining our ability to control how much information about ourselves that we share? And I know that you were just discussing, that people might not be aware of what they're sharing or who they're sharing it with, because they don't realize that they're being targeted or even assess their, their eye movement, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem because people are definitely not aware about these technologies and how they get rolled out. I mean, a good example is Meta is launching their next generation of headset, and that next generation of headset has facial tracking. It can track your facial expressions. Now, why are they doing that? They're not doing that because they're evil. They're doing that because when they track your facial expressions, they can then have avatars reflect those expressions. And so it's actually a humanizing technology. It will make the metaverse more human. It will allow people to interact better. It has these very positive uses. What people have to realize is, okay, it has these positive uses, but there are also these really negative uses, because when they can track your facial expressions, they can monitor your emotions, and they can then use those emotions to target you and to influence you and to do these things. People aren't culturally ready for that. The legal protections aren't ready for that. There are no regulations in place that protect us from that. And, and the thing is, to be able to enable a world where that technology can be used for the positive things, but not used for the negative things, the only way to do that is with regulation. I mean, the culture demanding that protections be put in place would help as well. I mean, if people are asking for regulation, and the only way they're going to ask for regulation is if they understand, hey, there's this cool new technology that's in the latest headset, but I should be worried that they can now read my emotions and they could know my reaction to everything that happens. So throughout my entire day, they could know exactly not just what I did, but how did I feel about that at every moment of the day. If people realize that that's possible, they'd say, you know what, that should be regulated. They shouldn't be allowed to store that information.
I thought that you beautifully illustrated actually in the story with the halos. I thought that was a really visual but clear way to explain exactly that to make people think twice about, do you want other people to see this information about you?
Yeah, and that's voluntary. That's the other piece. Like, we voluntarily give all this information without thinking about it. And again, partly it's people just choose to do it, but a lot of people feel pressured to do it. They feel pressured to share information on social media because if they don't, they feel at a disadvantage. And the same thing will happen in the metaverse. And that will take cultural change more than a regulation to get people to realize, hey, maybe we should all stop doing things quite like that.
And you talked about meaningful regulation. You said that you're also involved in not only writing stories but also these sort of big documents. And in your recent paper, Regulating the Metaverse: A Blueprint for the Future, can you explain a little bit about what that means to you? And do you think this is just a question of law and regulation, or are there wider issues to consider?
I mean, I think it is. I think it will be to affect culture, so people want to be protected from the abuses, because one way, if people are aware and there are multiple companies competing, if one company launches a safe metaverse that doesn't do these practices, people could choose that path, and that even without regulation, that could help. I personally think regulation is needed in parallel with that, because just like I mentioned with Roblox, which platform for kids, they do lots of good stuff to protect kids from abuses, and yet they're already going towards immersive advertising, and so it really shows that most of these platforms will go in that direction. But so in terms of regulation, I think that it's really about regulating the two sides of it, which is the tracking and profiling and the targeting with persuasion. On the tracking and profiling, the thing that's a little bit tricky is that these platforms need to be able to track in real time all of these things about you. They need to know where you are and what direction you're looking, and how you're standing. They need to potentially know your facial expressions to make your avatar look right. They just don't need to store this information over time, and they definitely don't need to profile you by running machine learning on this information over time. And so there's this big difference between tracking information at the moment that they're simulating the world and storing it and profiling you and using artificial intelligence on it. Because if they're allowed to track and store and use artificial intelligence on it, they will not only know everything you do all day, they'll be able to then predict exactly what you're going to do at every moment. They will use this information to make these predictive models to say, oh, the way to influence that particular person is to do this and this and this, because we've, our AI that looked at their entire life for the last 6 months knows that's how you influence that person. And that's really, really dangerous. And we've never seen anything like that before. And so regulating how that data is stored and used and whether it even can be stored over time would be super helpful. And then on the other side, it's looking at, what are they allowed to do to actually influence you? They're good, advertising there's going to be advertising. It's going to be immersive, meaning it's going to be virtual product placements. It's going to be virtual spokespeople. It's like the story. It's going to be, little flying creatures that whisper in your ear. That the question is, are you the user? Do you have the right to know what is promotional, what is targeted information, and what is just a natural part of the world? If at the base level, I can clearly tell the difference. If somebody walks up to me on the street and starts talking to me, if they look different, so I know, oh, that's an advertisement that just walked up to me, and it's not just another user, that's a first big step in protecting, in really protecting people from this boundary between advertising and manipulation. And without regulation, I think it will very quickly cross from just traditional advertising to manipulation, because people will be deceived. They won't know even what is an advertisement. And so regulation has a big role to play. The public should also demand it. So the culture has a big role to play.
As a parent, your Roblox story is absolutely horrific. And I don't let my son play it anyway. And now he's never going to be able to play it for the rest of his life. But what role do you think regulation can play or should play in specifically keeping children and young people safe in the metaverse?
In the metaverse, all these dangers, tracking, profiling, and also targeting, are even more dangerous for kids. Even with just traditional advertising, kids have a harder time telling the difference between an advertisement and just an authentic experience. In the metaverse, we're all going to have a harder time telling the difference unless there's regulation. And so the level of protections for kids is even more important than for adults. The protections for kids could potentially or should potentially come first versus adults. But honestly, I think we all need the protections. So I would opt for, let's put protections in place for everybody, and let's pay special attention to kids, because we know that they're even more impressionable and even less aware about data privacy than adults.
And I mean, one of the questions that my colleagues were saying is, should children be excluded altogether from the metaverse? But I mean, as we can see with Meta, that hasn't worked with trying to exclude the under 13s. That's possibly just not practical.
So it doesn't work to prevent kids. And in fact, in a lot of ways, kids are actually the largest group of users of the metaverse. Roblox and Minecraft are the closest to a metaverse in terms of large scale, general purpose metaverse than anything. And that's, those are for kids, and mostly for kids. And in some sense, that's preparing them for their future. Like there's a positive side to that, because this technology is going to only become more and more significant, and they're becoming skilled in that world. But that's all the more reason why they need protections. And very clear protections for kids, and it should be age-specific protections, because again, it's kids are impressionable. Kids are not aware of protecting their own privacy, and kids have to worry even more, not just about corporations and advertising, but just other bad actors. One of the biggest dangers in the metaverse for kids is that adults can pretend to be kids in the metaverse. Bad actors can pretend to be other people. There will be new forms of of fraud and deception where, people hijack avatars that look like a friend or look like a family member or look like a coworker. And so there are these other dangers that that will require really strict identity protection in the metaverse, and that it should be a requirement on the platforms that that they really take identity protection seriously, because in the metaverse, if you don't know that the person that you're talking to is actually that person, even if they look and sound like that person, that's that's a really dangerous situation for everybody, even more dangerous for kids.
I mean, what for you is the main sort of potential for harm, and what sort of advice would you give to parents?
I mean, at the present time, the main potential for harm is, predators, right? Predators who can, in the metaverse, in a virtual world, can hide behind avatars. I mean, even just on, traditional social media, people can hide behind, text, and that's dangerous, and all those problems exist, and all kinds of bad things happen. In the metaverse, they can hide behind an avatar. That avatar again could look like a big friendly teddy bear, or that avatar could look like somebody who they think is their friend, they think is their sibling, who they think is their family member. And so the potential for being confused about the identity of the person you're talking to, and actually think that it's somebody that is really significant in the metaverse. Parents should make their kids aware that just because somebody looks like a kid doesn't mean that they're a kid. Just because somebody looks like somebody they know, that might not actually even be the person that they think they know. I mean, at this point, awareness is the best that you can do, but regulation would go a long way to helping put real guardrails in place, and to require identity validation and authenticity that just it needs to be taken to a much stricter level than just traditional social media platforms.
I mean, really, until I met you, until I started looking into this subject, I had no idea what the metaverse is. It's such a mind-blowing concept. And that's why, as you say, we absolutely need regulation. It's brilliant to get in on the start, but it's so hard to engage people of something that is so out there.
It is, and it's for a lot of people, it feels like it's far in the future, but for the largest companies in the world, it's not far in the future. For the largest companies in the world, they are investing billions, and it's not just Meta. It's every large tech company, Apple and Google and Samsung and Sony, and every big company you can think of has a metaverse strategy and metaverse product development, and is working on products. And so, for me, when I got involved, 1991, working on metaverse, and I really thought that, within 10 years, this would be everywhere, because there really is there's a positive part to this, which is what the metaverse is really doing is it's presenting information to people in the form that we were meant to perceive it. Like, we were not meant to look through little windows at flat documents. We were meant to interact with information all around us. That's how we understand our world. And so 30 years ago, I was sure that, okay, when these technologies allow this, it will be everywhere within 10 years. And it's taken 30 years, but now we're at a point where it's really different than it's been in previous decades, where it's not just technologists who are excited. It's not just small companies that are excited. It's the largest companies in the world. They're investing billions of dollars, and they are convinced it's going to happen. And if they're convinced, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And I mean, within Metaverse 2030, you suggest that, like every technology, augmented reality will experience growing pains, and hopefully these will be ironed out over time if we take steps now. But what do you think about, more generally, about the sort of data harms on a broader scale that we're already seeing, that you're describing in some of the developing gaming technology for children, and essentially the potential if this proceeds without the right intervention?
Yeah, I mean, so like you said, there's a lot of dangers that already exist with current technologies, current social media technologies, current gaming technologies. These risks get amplified as we move, into these immersive worlds where everything is far more intimate. The public needs to be aware of the risks at all levels, including existing, current technologies, and the public needs to demand, basically a safe digital life, and that involves that involves regulation, and it also involves customers, choosing, which products, which companies that they go with for, on these issues at all levels, including existing, current technologies, and the public needs to demand, basically a safe digital life, and that involves that involves regulation, and it also involves customers, choosing, which products, which companies that they go with for, on these issues. If companies start competing with each other on these issues of, protecting privacy and not sharing data, and not, selling your data to brokers, then then consumers can choose the the companies that are acting better. But if the public isn't even aware, then that won't become a competitive playing field. So it's about awareness, it's about regulation, and it's about the public realizing that they need to demand the platforms that they want, not just accept what's out there. And it's hard because you don't really get a choice, and nobody reads the data protection documents that come up. I mean, it's the whole system is designed to just assume that the public, is just going to agree to anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Trying to avoid the pitfalls, to avoid these data harms, but to hope that there is a way forward, that we can actually appreciate and benefit from the advantages of the metaverse without coming a cropper by all the sort of potential obstacles. Now, you wrote an article recently and you described the system's ability to discover your location, height, length of your arms, gender, age, etc., etc. So for someone listening to this who may be thinking, so what? Can you articulate why, what the problem is with these online environments, being able to derive this sort of information about their users?
Yeah, so I mean, so at UC Berkeley, they did a really interesting study where they created this virtual escape room. It just felt like a game. You go into the game, you put on a current headset, today's technology that you could go out and buy. You put it on, and you go through this set of tests, and then they show at the end, look at all the information that they can get from you. And they're getting that information because when you put on this headset, they're tracking your head motion, they're tracking your hand motion. They can tell how tall you are. They can tell, actually how you're physically walking and stepping and moving. And so with this, they can know, they can derive medical information about you. They could see, there's likely this person has certain medical conditions. They were able to tell if somebody is colorblind. They were able to tell if people had some mental decline. And so you as the user have no idea that this type of information could be derived from this simple experience. And so they built this system to show, hey, the type of data that's being collected is so extensive that when we combine it over even just a short period, 20 minutes in this what felt like a game, and we do some artificial intelligence processing to it, we can know all these things about you that you would never guess that we would know. And so it is, it's a wake-up call that even data that seems innocent can be, quite invasive. A great example is tracking gait, like you're walking, and augmented reality will, be able to track your walking. Just from tracking gait, people can tell all kinds of medical information about physical problems, even mental problems, mental disabilities, just based on how somebody walks, how quickly they walk. So it is, the privacy that we need to protect is not just the data that you see on the surface, it's what can be inferred from that data. And so this whole category of inferred data, people need to be aware that this, there is a lot that, especially with use of AI, there's a lot people can know about you, even if it seems like they're not getting that much information.
It's incredible because on the one hand, this technology has got the ability to prolong your life, to detect medical conditions, but on the other, it could expose people to the weaponization of data if it falls into the hands of bad actors. Do you think that most people have an understanding of how they're tracked, profiled, and persuaded? I mean, essentially, you've pretty much covered this and said, no, they don't. But I think this is a good example of, I guess, how the technology is constantly evolving. And the example of this escape room just shows how quickly it's evolving.
Yeah, I mean, people are more aware now than they were, just because of a lot of the negatives that came out around social media. But I think they still don't appreciate this, the significance, and it's partly because of how powerful artificial intelligence has become so recently. There's data that's tracked, then there's data that's stored, and then once you have a store of data about a person over a period of time, artificial intelligence, machine learning can be run on that data and can infer all kinds of things about that person's likely behaviors, likely preferences, likely interests, likely reactions to different things, how people react to different advertisements, how people react to different news information. And so people should be just aware that it's not just the simple data that's collected at the moment, it's how that data collected over time can characterize you at a really, really deep level, and how AI is making those characterizations more and more accurate and also more and more predictive, in which they can actually predict how you'll be influenced if we feed you a certain piece of news, how you'll be influenced if we feed you a certain advertisement. Awareness, hopefully will make people, again, demand change.
It's such a fascinating subject. And I was just thinking, and just in whose hands that technology rests as well. And it's lovely, you're speaking from the US, I'm in the UK, Guernsey, apologies. And, we generally live in fairly safe democratic societies. And so we can talk about these things. For starters, we can talk about them because in some jurisdictions, you cannot have this conversation. They don't want people to know that these sorts of technologies exist. But essentially, if you had just one insight to share for people listening to this, for our sort of people data protection community, but we're trying to bring about cultural change. If you had one insight that you would share, or one thing that you'd like people to take away with them, what would that be?
I think it's, with respect to the metaverse, to me, the key thing for people to realize is that for 30 years, the technology has been developing to be the most effective tool for fooling the senses that we could create. That's the entire purpose of virtual reality, augmented reality, is to blur the boundaries between what's real and what's not real, to create suspension of disbelief among completely fabricated things. And so when we think about the dangers of the metaverse, we need to realize that those things can be used against you. That the metaverse could become the most powerful tool of persuasion that we've ever created, because it has the ability to fabricate anything, and it has the ability to track you and profile you at levels that we've never seen before. That said, regulation and guardrails could prevent that and could make the metaverse a safe and magical place that can do, really amazing things for education and medicine and entertainment. But we need the guardrails.